everybody. My name is John Dinkel. I'll be presenting today on the influence of geography in the development and formation of Korea, what we know as modern-day Korea. I'll mostly be focusing on the Three Kingdoms period and talking about kind of how they form, focusing in on each individual kingdoms initially, and then I'll talk just in a very short 1 minute at max, so the influence and impacts that has on modern-day Korea as well. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to talk about, the overview of the topography, followed by each of the individual kingdoms, followed by some of the connections that it has to the neighboring countries, as well as a short summary at the end. So the first thing that I'd like to focus on is these particular maps. So we see as modern day Korea, we have the four individualized kingdoms, Japan across the way. I believe a lot of my thesis is the formation of these kingdoms, seeing as they weren't necessarily like borderlands, they were here, but more so cities that outstretched, and this is where we kind of lose the direct connection between one country and another. I also believe that these formations of these countries were also majoritively formed due to the native topography that they were located in. For example, this is maybe Baekje at its height, but if you look at like Gaya, where it would be right here, or Shilla, where it is right in along here, we have a lot of natural boundaries that form because of the mountains, that form because of the rivers being the Han. If you look up here, we have the Tumen and the Yangtze right here. So we have a lot of natural boundaries that happen that cause the formation of these kingdoms. We can also see, for example, how each of these individual geographical markers actually also benefit the type of society that each of these individual kingdoms came up with. So if we were to look at it and anglified it here, is some of these natural boundaries. A major one being the Han River, and then also one of these being the Nakdong River here, and the Taebaek Mountains that come in right along here. Come also down here a little bit. Also, so the climate is also a very, very interesting part that I want to point out before I get into distinguishing how these influence the individual kingdoms, is what is the weather? If you look at, for example, where Gaya would be located right down here, we have quite a bit different weather system than we would have on an area that has the steeps with the Shilla Kingdom, or the continental climate and the humid climate here coming in Baekje with all these different rivers coming in here. This is because the ocean coming in here from the East Sea or the Japan Sea, whatever you like to call it. I call it Japan Sea. Coming in across here and keeping everything cooler. Despite the latitude, keeping it somewhat cool and allowing these valleys also to give some good farmland here. While though we still have this warm climate here, we kind of see some natural boundaries also forming that we can almost align to the previous three kingdoms on here. So the first major point that I'd like to talk about is the half island. This idea of being a half island, I think, is actually extremely unique to Korea being a peninsular country or a peninsular group of kingdoms. That is, despite the fact that they're surrounded by water on three sides, Koguryo to the north is, while it's extremely expansive, I don't believe that directly correlates to militaristic power any part. Simply they have more neighbors to deal with. And the fact that we have on our all side, these individualized kingdoms almost grow up not necessarily in isolation, but have a very interconnected history due to the fact that their only way up into China, which is their major neighbor, is up through this top half. Well, you do have some connection with Baekje jumping over here directly to China across here. And then later when we have the importance of like Port Arthur and whatnot up here, this particular shape of the country, as well as their particular sitting between two superpowers, I can test that though they at one time were a shrimp among whales, as Dr. Peterson would put it, that the shape and the connection of their country actually defines how their culture somewhat evolved, and that what also helps them later evolve into, I believe, it would be a giant with other giants. So so first let's focus in on Baekje. So Baekje or Baekje here, depending on the Romanized script that you're going to use. One of the main points of Baekje that we see from our classes, as well as we see from some of the histories, is the importance of trade to Baekje. The symbols meaning 100 different ways, right? Is if you look at the concentration of rivers coming in here right around the Seoul area. Also, if you want to look at natural ports, Many countries, particularly countries that are formed on archipelagos, are the importance of the trade focuses majoritively on the natural ports that form on the island, or form, in this case, the peninsula. If you look on the Sheila side, or the eastern side of the continent, there's really no big place for a boat to pull into. There's a couple of little ones down here around Busan, and if you notice Busan, how big it grew up compared to other smaller areas, because these mountains drop right into the ocean, there's really no major natural places for ships to pull in. But if you look on Baekje's side, this rough shoreline is indicative of a naturally high trade continent. If you look to jump over to Japan, for example, majority of the trade that's happening in Japan is happening near Tokyo, Osaka, and happening on the east side of the country as opposed to the west coast where's the Japan Sea, because there's no natural places. You can also see this because of what comes into the country, where Buddhism comes in through being able to jump across here to China, as well as the importance of the Han River, which later, I believe, helps in some of the protection against Kogyo in some of the contentions that happen between the countries. Next, I'd like to point out is Sheila. Now, each of these individual maps that I'm showing are showing each of the individualized countries during the height of their power. As you can see, Sheila here has already consumed Gaia and has gone all the way up to Kogyo on this particular map. However, if you look at it from a strictly geographical perspective, these mountains here bordering between them and Baekje basically leaves only really Gaia to be eaten up by a power. It's the one with the least amount of physical barriers between it and other kingdoms. You don't have any extremely large rivers. The rivers go up here, the Nakdong River right here, as well as the Han River, are not anywhere near where Gaia once was. So it makes it a fair, but now this wasn't conquered in any bloody conquest. It was simply the closeness and proximity that made it easier, one could say, than a larger neighboring the three kingdoms. This is also where Korea gets the claim over Dokdo, is coming also from Sheila as well, or Takeshima. The next one is the importance of Gaia. It's neighboring ports of Japan. Now, this small area does have a lot of natural ports, as you can see here, and it also is the closest in distance to areas like Kyushu in Japan. Now, this has a lot more natural ports than you can see up over here in Sheila, which would lead me to believe, comparing it to other countries, that the natural ability for it to do trade to countries like Japan would be raised due to the ability of natural ports. And also its direct connection to the Tsushima Strait. This also gives the ability of knowledge of these currents is what allowed Isun Shin to win his battles and allowed Korea to be a dagger pointed at Japan's throat, so it was so poetically put. Now, though it is the least advantageous position out of the three quote-unquote kingdoms, I do believe that it was given an advantage when it came to doing trade with Japan. Whether it was doing trade to import to Japan or whether it was simply taking from Japan is not the point of my presentation. Lastly is Kogyo. Now, Kogyo covers it covers the majority of the land usage that we see out of the three kingdoms. However, anytime that it surges down, we see on the video that Dr. Peterson showed in class, was that it never really passes much past the Han River down here, which is the barrier between it and Baekje. However, just because it has, I think, a common misconception when I was explaining this to a couple of friends and doing this as a dry run, was the fact that because it was so big, it obviously must have been the most powerful. Though it did have many skirmishes with Japan and the numerous buffer countries around China up here, I simply think that it ended up being one of the smaller countries down here that allowed the conquering of Kogyo later. Because close proximity has the majority of trade with China, comparatively to Baekje, and then it is a highly mountainous, despite the fact that this is an extremely large area. How am I doing on time?
You're going to.
Oh, I can't remember. A lot of this area is pretty much untillable. Lastly, it was brought up previously in the class that Korea is a shrimp among whale, but I believe it's more to be a dagger at Japan's throat. Though it may be the road like people like Hideyoshi used to march up and it has instances of being conquered, I don't think it can be ignored how the uniqueness of this particular peninsula offered natural barriers between kingdoms, and also I believe that influenced the high level of peace. I think often when we think of history, we try to look at it in terms of majority of battles and the relationship like we see in Japan with the Onin Wars, or like all these different very close areas, but there's really no big physical barrier that stops one area from getting to another. It does have connection to culture in Japan because of its natural language and natural proximity to it, as well as being a half island does insulate it from other individualized countries that could impose greater amounts of tax. Now, just stepping one step into modern, the drawing of the 38th parallel has little to nothing to do at all with Korean history. It's simply an arbitrary drawing drawn along the middle. I would have gone into this a little bit more had I had more time. However, if there are any questions, I'll take them now, and thank you very much. This is 감사합니다 in Japanese. This.
Okay, who's next then?
I think that would
Be Greg?
be,
Okay. And John, on your
Yes, sir.